A general climbed a mountain in darkness to prove empires don't fall. By sunset, he would be dead, his army shattered, and the British Empire would suffer the most humiliating military defeat in its history at the hands of farmers who had never attended a military academy. The date was February 27th, 1881. The place was a flat-topped hill in South Africa that would become synonymous with catastrophic arrogance. What happened on Majuba Hill didn't just end a war. It revealed a truth the Victorian British had spent decades denying. Technology and discipline mean nothing when facing men fighting for their land against invaders they despise. General Sir George Pomeroy Colley was everything the British establishment admired. Eton-educated, staff college-trained, veteran of multiple colonial campaigns, intellectual, confident, and blessed with the absolute certainty that comes from never truly being tested. At 45, he was the youngest general in the British Army and governor of Natal. He spoke multiple languages, wrote military theory, and believed utterly in British superiority. When Boer farmers in the Transvaal Republic declared independence from British rule in December 1880, Colley viewed their rebellion as a temporary irritation requiring swift correction. He would spend the next 2 months learning that conviction is not the same as competence. The Transvaal Boers were not the enemy Colley imagined. These were Afrikaners, descendants of Dutch settlers who had trekked into the interior to escape British control decades earlier. They had carved farms from hostile wilderness, fought Zulu armies, survived droughts and diseases, and developed a culture that valued independence above everything else. Every Boer man was raised with a rifle in his hands. They hunted game for survival, shot from horseback, estimated range instinctively, and could place a bullet in a target at distances British soldiers considered impossible. They had no uniforms, no parade drills, no formal ranks. What they had was mobility, marksmanship, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. They also had something Colley never understood. They were fighting for survival, not glory. The war began badly for Colley. On December the 20th, 1880, at Bronkhorst's Pruit, a Boer commando ambushed a British column, killing or wounding 250 men in minutes. The British had been marching in parade formation, band playing, completely unprepared for combat. The Boers used cover, fired from concealment, and disappeared before the British could organize a response. It was a preview of what was coming, but Colley dismissed it as an aberration. He assembled a relief column to march to Pretoria and restore order. He never reached his destination. On January 28, 1881, at Lang's Neck, Colley attacked a Boer position blocking the road to Pretoria. He ordered a frontal assault up a steep hillside against entrenched enemies with superior rifles. The British advanced in neat lines, as if they were on a European battlefield facing conscript armies with smoothbore muskets. The Boers had Wesley Richards and Martini Henry rifles, far more accurate than the weapons Colley's troops carried. They waited until the British were at optimal range, then opened fire. British soldiers fell in rows. Officers died trying to rally their men. The assault collapsed. Colley lost 198 casualties to 41 Boer losses. He retreated to lick his wounds and reconsider his assumptions. He reconsidered nothing. 1 week later at Ngogo River, Boer commandos caught Colley's column in the open. This time, Colley had no choice but to form a defensive square and fight. The battle lasted hours, fought in pouring rain that turned the ground to mud. The Boers never charged, never exposed themselves unnecessarily. They used dead ground, moved position constantly, and kept up a steady, accurate fire. When darkness fell, both sides disengaged. The British held the field but lost 139 men. The Boers lost 8. Colley limped back to his base camp at Mount Prospect. Having been defeated twice in 2 weeks by farmers, he considered militarily insignificant. His response was not to change tactics, but to attempt something more dramatic. Majuba Hill dominated the landscape near Lang's Neck. It rose 2,000 feet above the surrounding terrain. The Boers, lost 8. Colley limped back to his base camp at Mount Prospect. Having been defeated twice in 2 weeks by farmers, he considered militarily insignificant. His response was not to change tactics, but to attempt something more dramatic. Majuba Hill dominated the landscape near Lang's Neck. It rose 2,000 feet above the surrounding terrain. a massive tabletop mountain with steep sides and a relatively flat summit. From its peak, you could observe every Boer position for miles. Colley studied the hill through his binoculars and conceived a plan that seemed brilliant in its simplicity. He would take the hill at night, position artillery on the summit, and force the Boers to either attack uphill against superior position or abandon their positions at Lang's Neck. It would be a bloodless victory achieved through tactical superiority. The plan had one fatal flaw. Colley was neither as clever nor as competent as he believed himself to be. On the night of February 26, 1881, Colley assembled a force of approximately 400 men. He took companies from the 58th Regiment, the 92nd Gordon Highlanders, the 60th Rifles, and some naval personnel with 3 Gatling guns and 2 field pieces. He did not take his best troops. He did not bring enough ammunition. He did not inform his second-in-command of his intentions. He simply led his men out of camp at 10 p.m. and began climbing Majuba in darkness. The climb took hours. Men stumbled on loose rocks. Equipment rattled. The Gatling guns had to be hauled up by rope. Somehow, impossibly, the Boers did not detect them. The British reached the summit around 4 a.m. Colley positioned his men around the perimeter of the flat plateau, which measured roughly 1,000 yards across. He placed the Gatling guns to cover the most likely approaches. Then he made a series of decisions that would doom his command. He did not order his men to dig trenches or build stone sangars, despite ample time and materials. He did not send patrols down the slopes to prevent Boer infiltration. He did not ensure his troops had adequate ammunition reserves. He did not establish clear command structures or fallback positions. He simply assumed that holding the high ground was sufficient. At sunrise, he stood on the edge of the plateau, surveyed the Boer positions below, and sent a heliograph message to his base. "Occupied Majuba last night. Boers are packing up and leaving." It was the last optimistic message he would ever send. The Boers were not packing up. When dawn revealed British troops on Majuba's summit, the Boer commanders held an immediate council of war. They faced a difficult tactical problem. Attacking uphill against entrenched positions with clear fields of fire was suicide, but allowing the British to dominate Majuba would compromise every Boer position in the region. Some argued for siege and starvation. Others advocated for flanking movements. Then, someone made the obvious observation. The British had climbed the mountain in darkness. If the British could reach the summit, so could Boers, and Boers were better shots. Commandant Nicholas Smith volunteered to lead the assault. He took approximately 450 men, mostly from the Heidelberg and Pretoria commandos. These were experienced fighters, many of whom had participated in the earlier victories. They began climbing around 6 a.m., not in formation, but in small groups, using every fold of ground, every boulder, every patch of vegetation for cover. The climb was exhausting, nearly vertical in places, but they had spent their lives moving through difficult terrain. They climbed in silence, rifles slung across their backs, conserving energy for the fight they knew was coming. The British on the summit saw the Boers climbing, but made another catastrophic error. They did not shoot. Colley had ordered his men not to waste ammunition firing at targets beyond effective range. This might have been prudent if the Boers were climbing in massed formation at 800 yards. But the Boers were climbing in small groups, and every minute they were not being shot at was a minute closer to the summit. By the time British soldiers finally opened fire, the leading Boers had reached positions less than 200 yards from the plateau edge. At that range, Boer marksmanship became devastating. The Boers did not charge the summit in a heroic rush. They infiltrated it, moving from rock to rock, finding natural shooting positions just below the plateau rim where they were partially protected but could fire upward at the British silhouettes against the sky. They aimed deliberately, fired single shots, reloaded, and fired again. British soldiers began falling with head and chest wounds. Officers were targeted specifically. Sergeants trying to organize defensive lines were shot down. The Gordon Highlanders, wearing distinctive uniforms, attracted particular attention. Men who stood to fire found themselves dead before they could pull the trigger. Colley moved along his perimeter trying to organize a coherent defense, but the situation was deteriorating by the minute. His troops were spread too thin around the large plateau. The Boers were now shooting from multiple angles. The Gatling guns, positioned to cover approaches, could not depress their barrels enough to hit targets just below the rim. The two field pieces were equally useless in close quarters fighting. British soldiers found themselves lying exposed on flat ground, taking fire from enemies they could barely see, unable to return effective fire without exposing themselves to instant death. Panic began to spread. Around 9 a.m., several Boers reached the actual plateau surface. They took position behind rocks and began shooting into the British rear. This shattered what remained of British cohesion. Soldiers realized they were being shot from behind as well as from the edges. Some units broke and ran for the rear of the plateau. Others tried to form defensive squares, but that tactic only created concentrated targets. Officers screamed orders that were ignored or misunderstood. The careful British discipline that had conquered half the world evaporated in the face of invisible enemies who shot with impossible accuracy. Colley saw his battle collapsing. He grabbed a rifle, something generals rarely did, and moved to the forward edge of the plateau to rally his men by personal example. He knelt, aimed at a Boer position, and was shot through the forehead. He died instantly, his body falling forward onto the ground he had been so confident of holding. His death removed whatever slim chance existed for organizing a fighting withdrawal. When word spread that the general was dead, British resistance effectively ended. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers abandoned their rifles and ran for the rear slope of Majuba. The problem was that the rear slope was nearly vertical, a desperate scramble down loose rock and steep inclines with Boers shooting from above. Men lost their footing and tumbled hundreds of feet. Some threw away their equipment to move faster. Others froze in terror and were shot where they cowered. The Boers pursued to the plateau edge and continued firing at the fleeing British. Some Boers descended the rear slope after the British, shooting them at close range. It was not battle anymore. It was slaughter. The British left 92 dead on Majuba, including Colley and many of his officers. Another 134 were wounded, and 59 were captured. The Boer casualties totaled 1 killed and 5 wounded. The disparity was almost incomprehensible. A British force of 400 trained soldiers, holding high ground with artillery support, had been destroyed by Boer farmers climbing uphill with only rifles. The numbers told a story that the British military establishment would spend years trying to explain away or ignore. The survivors staggered back to Mount Prospect in complete disorder. Some didn't stop running until they reached the camp. Others hid in the bush until darkness and crept back after nightfall. The wounded were left on Majuba until the Boers allowed British medical personnel to retrieve them the next day. When the British came to collect their dead, they found Colley's body where he had fallen, rifle still beside him, a small hole in his forehead. The Boers had not looted the British dead or mutilated the bodies, which was noted with some surprise by British observers who had been conditioned to expect savage behavior from colonial enemies. News of Majuba reached London in mid-March. The initial reports were confused and contradictory. Some papers refused to believe that a British general had been killed leading a routed army. As more details emerged, disbelief turned to shock, then humiliation, then rage. How could the greatest military power on earth be defeated by farmers? The Liberal government under Prime Minister William Gladstone faced intense pressure to send massive reinforcements and avenge the defeat. Gladstone refused. He had opposed the annexation of the Transvaal from the beginning and saw Majuba as confirmation that the war was unjust. He chose to negotiate peace rather than escalate the conflict. The Pretoria Convention, signed in August 1881, granted the Transvaal Republic self-government under nominal British suzerainty. The Boers had won. They had fought the British Empire to a standstill and forced recognition of their independence through military victory. This was almost unprecedented in Victorian imperial history. Colonial rebellions were supposed to be crushed, not negotiated with. The psychological impact was enormous. If Boer farmers could defeat the British Army, who else might try? The British military establishment spent years analyzing what went wrong at Majuba. Official inquiries blamed Colley for tactical errors while defending the overall British military system. Critics pointed out that Colley's mistakes were systemic, not individual. He had been trained to fight European wars where massed infantry, artillery supremacy, and disciplined volleys won battles. He faced an enemy that ignored all those rules and won anyway. The Boers used cover, mobility, and marksmanship instead of formations and firepower. They fought as individuals rather than as units. They adapted to terrain rather than trying to impose European battle conventions on African landscapes. These lessons should have revolutionized British military doctrine. They were largely ignored. 18 years later, in 1899, Britain went to war with the Boer republics again. The Second Boer War was supposed to be a quick campaign of revenge and imperial consolidation. Instead, it became a 3-year nightmare that required 450,000 British and Imperial troops to defeat 88,000 Boer fighters. The British won that war through attrition, scorched earth tactics, and concentration camps that killed thousands of Boer civilians. But they won it slowly, expensively, and in ways that damaged Britain's international reputation for decades. The ghost of Majuba haunted every British defeat in that war. The Boers who had learned their tactics fighting at Majuba taught those tactics to a new generation. The British who should have learned from Majuba apparently forgot everything. The legacy of Majuba extends far beyond the immediate military consequences. It demonstrated that technological and numerical superiority do not guarantee victory if the enemy fights intelligently on familiar terrain. It showed that morale, motivation, and skill can overcome firepower and discipline. It proved that imperial armies trained for European warfare were vulnerable to guerrilla tactics and asymmetric warfare. Every insurgency, every colonial independence movement, every guerrilla war of the 20th century could look back at Majuba as proof that empires can be defeated by determined locals who refuse to fight by the empire's rules. For the Boers, Majuba became a foundational myth. It was proof that God favored them, that their cause was just, that individual liberty and martial skill trumped regimented tyranny. Paul Kruger, who would become president of the Transvaal Republic, built his political career partly on the victory at Majuba. The battle became a symbol of Afrikaner nationalism, celebrated in songs, stories, and memorials. When the Second Boer War began, Boer commanders invoked Majuba to inspire their troops and terrify their enemies. The psychological advantage was real. British soldiers going into combat against Boers carried the knowledge that their predecessors had been humiliated, that their officers had proven incompetent, that their enemy had won before and might win again. The personal tragedy of George Colley adds a human dimension to the strategic disaster. He was not a monster or a fool, despite what his decisions at Majuba might suggest. He was a product of his system, educated and trained to believe in British invincibility, rewarded throughout his career for that belief, and given command precisely because he embodied the confidence the empire required of its generals. His mistake was not unique. It was institutional. Dozens of British officers in colonial wars made similar assumptions and suffered similar defeats. Colley just happened to die for his mistakes in a particularly visible and humiliating way. His widow received his personal effects months after his death, including the rifle he had been holding when shot. She never remarried and spent the rest of her life defending his reputation against critics who blamed him for the disaster. The Boers who climbed Majuba that morning were not professional soldiers seeking glory. They were farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who wanted the British to leave them alone. After the battle, they returned to their farms and businesses. There were no medals, no promotions, no victory parades. The Transvaal Republic lacked the resources or inclination for such ceremonies. The men who had defeated a British general and destroyed his army simply went back to their ordinary lives, satisfied that they had protected their independence. This lack of triumphalism might have been their greatest victory. They had proven that you don't need military pageantry to win wars. You just need to shoot straight and refuse to quit. Military historians continue to debate the tactical details of Majuba. Some argue that Colley's position was fundamentally sound but poorly executed. Others contend that occupying the summit was a fatal error from the start. The consensus seems to be that Colley made multiple compounding mistakes: failing to fortify the position, inadequate ammunition supplies, poor perimeter security, dispersed forces, and fundamental misunderstanding of his enemy's capabilities. Any one of these errors might have been survivable. Together, they guaranteed disaster. The one decision that damns Colley most thoroughly is his refusal to dig in. He had hours of darkness to prepare defensive positions. Instead, he allowed his men to lie on open ground, assuming that altitude alone would protect them. When the Boers began shooting, British soldiers had nowhere to hide. The Boer tactics at Majuba became a textbook example of fire and movement, small unit tactics, and exploitation of terrain. Modern special forces and infantry still study the battle as an example of how to attack a fortified position without artillery or numerical superiority. The Boers essentially invented what would later be called fire and maneuver doctrine, where small groups provide covering fire while others advance, then leapfrog forward in turn. They used natural cover brilliantly, never exposing themselves unnecessarily, always shooting from positions that offered protection. They targeted leaders to disrupt enemy command and control. They maintained fire discipline, making every shot count rather than blazing away ineffectively. These are fundamental military principles. But in 1881, they were revolutionary because European armies had forgotten them in favor of massed firepower and parade ground discipline. The international reaction to Majuba varied by nation and political perspective. The French, still bitter about colonial rivalries with Britain, found the British defeat amusing and instructive. French military theorists studied Majuba as evidence that European tactics needed revision. The Germans noted the Boer victory with interest and began incorporating lessons about dispersed formations and marksmanship into their own training. The Americans, themselves veterans of guerrilla warfare during the Revolution and more recently the Civil War, understood immediately what had happened. The Russians saw confirmation of their own theories about irregular warfare. The message was clear to everyone, except apparently the British. Modern rifles had changed warfare fundamentally, and armies that failed to adapt would be slaughtered. 20 years after Majuba, in 1901, a young British officer named Winston Churchill wrote about the Boer Wars. He had been captured and escaped during the Second Boer War and had seen firsthand how Boer tactics continued to frustrate British forces. He noted that the lessons of Majuba had been ignored, that British commanders in 1899 made the same mistakes Colley had made, and that thousands of British soldiers had died as a result. Churchill's observations were largely ignored by the military establishment. It would take the catastrophe of World War I to finally force British military doctrine to change. And even then, the changes came slowly and at tremendous cost. The physical site of Majuba Hill remains largely unchanged. You can still climb to the summit and see the terrain as Colley and the Boers saw it. The British dead are buried in a mass grave on the hillside, marked by a simple monument. The spot where Colley fell is marked with a cairn of stones. Standing there, looking down at the approaches the Boers climbed, you understand immediately why the British lost. The summit offers no natural defensive positions. It's too large to defend with 400 men. The edges are too close to provide adequate warning of attack. Any competent military officer should have recognized these problems. Colley either didn't see them or didn't care. His confidence killed him and destroyed his command. The question that haunts Majuba is whether the disaster was inevitable or avoidable. If Colley had fortified his position properly, could he have held? Probably yes, at least temporarily. If he had brought more ammunition and better troops, Would that have changed the outcome? Possibly, though Boer marksmanship would have remained devastating. If he had not occupied Majuba at all, would the war have ended differently? Almost certainly not, because the fundamental British problem was strategic, not tactical. They were trying to impose control on a people who valued independence above everything else and were willing to fight indefinitely to preserve it. No amount of tactical competence could overcome that strategic reality. The empire that seemed invincible in 1881 would begin its long decline within decades. Majuba wasn't the cause of that decline, but it was a symptom, an early warning sign that imperial confidence had exceeded imperial capability. The British would win many more colonial wars, but always at increasing cost, against increasing resistance, with decreasing legitimacy. The age of easy conquest was ending. Majuba marked the beginning of that end, the moment when farmers on a hilltop proved that empires bleed and generals die just like anyone else. On the evening of February the 27th, 1881, as the sun set over Majuba Hill, the survivors of Colley's command huddled in their camp trying to comprehend what had happened. Some were in shock, others were angry, many were ashamed. The Boers, meanwhile, held their positions and waited to see if the British would attack again. They didn't expect negotiations or peace. They expected the British to send more troops and continue the war. When Gladstone chose diplomacy instead, the Boers were surprised but grateful. They had won their independence not because they destroyed the British Empire, but because they made the cost of conquest exceed Britain's willingness to pay it. That might be the most important lesson of Majuba. You don't have to defeat an empire militarily. You just have to make them decide you're not worth the trouble. One morning on one hill, Boer farmers with rifles made that calculation inescapable. The empire that ruled half the world retreated, and nothing was ever quite the same again.